Over the years which I then spent running around with a notebook in my pocket, of course I came to see that frequently we failed to tell the truth. The unavoidable reality of journalism is that all of our work is tethered by a deadline, and we can never be free to roam as far as we want in search of the evidence we need. On the best of days, everything we write is compromised by error. And of course I knew, too, that from time to time there was some seriously dodgy behaviour going on behind the headlines. But until I worked my way into this project, I had no idea of just how weakened we had become, just how prone we now are to fail to tell the truth. I'm not talking about journalists making mistakes. Mistakes can be honest, and it's a very safe bet that there are mistakes in this book. I'm not talking about the individual, dishonest, hack scumbags who bring our whole profession into disrepute. There are still good, brave, honest people working in this industry. I'm talking about the fact that almost all journalists across the whole developed world now work within a kind of professional cage which distorts their work and crushes their spirit. I'm talking about the fact that finally I was forced to admit that I work in a corrupted profession. Because I'm writing about the world in which I work, the world that has been handing me my paychecks all these years, I need to say something about conflicts of interest. I eventually got my first job when I was hired as a trainee with the Mirror Group on a cluster of local newspapers which they used to own in the West Country. I went from there briefly to the Sunday People, and then for a year to the London Evening Standard before I was hired as a news reporter by The Guardian in 1979. And that has been my professional anchor ever since. On the way through, I floated off for about 6 years to be Home Affairs correspondent of The Observer, chief feature writer at Robert Maxwell's London Daily News, a freelancer in Washington, D.C., and an on-screen reporter for Granada TV's World in Action before going back to The Guardian, where I still work on a freelance contract. Early on in this project, I established several rules. The first was that I would not draw on my personal knowledge of the private lives of the people I've worked with. I know a fair bit about sex and drugs and hypocrisy in Fleet Street. Executives whose papers support the war against drugs while shoving cocaine up their nostrils in the office toilets. Reporters who attack the sexual adventures of others while routinely dropping their own trousers at the first scent of a willing secretary. I've used none of that. First, because I think we shouldn't be writing about anybody's private life at all unless there is some really powerful public need to know about it. And second, because I don't want to be beaten up by former colleagues who might reasonably complain that I were betraying their confidence. The second rule was to try to start from a blank sheet. It wouldn't have been fair to target the media outlets for whom I've worked just because I had an inside track on the way they behave. Equally, it certainly wouldn't have been right to ignore them or favour them. So I set out to research the media in exactly the same way that I would research any subject. That applies in particular to The Guardian. I'm a Guardian man. I've read the paper since I was 14. I've worked for it for years, and when I came up with this project, the editor, Alan Rusbridger, agreed to support me while I pursued it. It needs to be said that never at any stage has anybody from The Guardian tried to impose any kind of restriction or requirement on what I've written, and you'll see that both The Guardian and its sister paper, The Observer, crop up here, rough and smooth. It follows from this that neither The Guardian nor anybody who works there is responsible for the content of the book. That's my responsibility. I've tended to dig out evidence from the UK, but at points I've tried to add information which shows that the same picture is true in other countries, particularly the United States. In the same way, I've tended to focus on print, but I've included some material to show how broadcasting is following the same pattern. I've said very little about tabloids. Nobody needs a book to tell them that the tabloids are an unreliable source of information about the world. My focus has been on the most prestigious and trusted of media outlets. I was given a big boost early on by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, who provided the funding for a huge piece of empirical research. That research was conducted by Cardiff University's School of Journalism, Media and Cultural Studies, led by Professor Justin Lewis.